My name is Jennifer Hayes. I'm 35 now, an interior designer in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But my story starts long before the contracts, the magazines, and the million-dollar projects. It starts with one text message from my mother that still rings in my mind like a gavel slamming down. "Don't call or come over. We're done." I remember the glow of the screen on that Tuesday night, the bitter smell of stale coffee from the mug on my desk, and my hand trembling as I typed back 2 words. Got it. I didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't call. That was it. Years of paying my family's bills, saving their restaurants, covering my brother's debts, and even funding my mother's medical care were dismissed in 6 words. But to understand why that moment was the end, you need to understand where it all began. I grew up in Tulsa, in what outsiders would have called the perfect American dream family. My father, Stephen, a local legend who built a chain of restaurants from a single greasy diner. My mother, who gave up her banking career to stand by his side, smoothing his temper and polishing his rough edges. My brother Brandon, 4 years younger, the golden child everyone believed would inherit the empire. And then there was me, Jennifer the misfit, who saw beauty not in sizzling steaks or profit margins, but in colors, lines, and the way a space could make people feel alive. The restaurants were the beating heart of our family. My childhood was filled with the sizzling sound of burgers hitting the flat top, the sharp tang of onions in the air, the steady clatter of plates as servers rushed past. I can still picture Dad at the corner booth after closing, cigar smoke curling above him while Brandon sat by his side, soaking up praise just for showing up. Dad's voice was always heavy with authority. "The restaurants are our future, Jennifer. You'll learn the business." But no matter how much I tried, I never belonged in that world. By high school, I was sketching floor plans in the margins of my notebooks instead of tallying receipts. I wanted to design interiors, spaces that told stories, but when I told Dad, he laughed. A deep, cutting sound. "That's a hobby, not a career." Mom's eyes slid away, silent, siding with him without a word. Brandon, only 13 then, smirked across the table, already wearing the smugness of someone who knew he was chosen. That was the first time I realized I was the odd one out, and if you've ever been the black sheep in your family, you know that sting. If you relate, hit the like button and drop a comment below. I'd love to know I'm not alone. At 17, when the acceptance letter came from a top art school in Chicago, I felt like the universe was finally telling me my dreams mattered. I remember the cold bite of that winter morning when I tore the envelope open, my breath fogging as I read the words, "Congratulations, Jennifer Hayes." My heart soared. Until I showed my father. He crossed his arms and said flatly, "If you're not joining the restaurants, you're on your own. No tuition, no support." Mom nodded silently, her lips pressed into a thin line, and Brandon grinned like he'd won some secret battle. In that moment, I realized I would have to fight for my dreams without them. I juggled waitressing shifts and tutoring gigs, pouring every ounce of energy into affording what scholarships didn't cover. I lived on instant noodles and stale coffee, my hands cramped from sketching late into the night, but I refused to quit. Yet even as I was grinding through school, the family favoritism never stopped haunting me. One Christmas when I came home, Brandon forgot to lock one of the restaurants, and a break-in cost thousands. Dad brushed it off. He's learning. Meanwhile, when I missed a family dinner to finish a design project, I got a lecture about priorities. Their message was clear. Brandon's mistakes were forgivable, but my ambitions were selfish indulgences. I didn't have the words for it then, but years later I stumbled into the subreddit r, divided by raised by narcissists, while scrolling late one night. Story after story mirrored my own siblings idolized no matter their failures, daughters dismissed for daring to dream differently. Reading those posts, I felt less crazy, less alone. According to the American Psychological Association, nearly 70% of children who grow up with clear parental favoritism report long-term resentment or estrangement from family. That statistic wasn't just a number. It was my life in black and white. College nearly broke me. There were nights I considered dropping out. Nights I stared at the cracked ceiling of my tiny dorm room and thought maybe Dad was right. Maybe interior design was just a hobby. I remember one especially dark evening, when the radiator clanked endlessly, and I had only $3 left in my account, wondering if it was worth it. That night, scrolling through forums, I read a therapist's advice on self-validation. Stop waiting for your family to clap for you. Be your own witness. The words hit me like a lifeline. I wrote them on a sticky note and kept it taped to my desk lamp for the next 4 years. Whenever Dad's voice echoed in my head, "That's not a career," I'd whisper back, "It is, and I'll prove it." Slowly, painfully, I carved out my path. I graduated, degree in hand, though my parents never came to the ceremony. Mom sent a text, "Proud of you." But even those words felt hollow when the next moment she turned to gush about Brandon, helping at the restaurant. Dad didn't call at all. I tried to swallow the hurt, telling myself one day they would see me, but the truth was sinking in. They had chosen Brandon long ago. By the time I returned to Tulsa, the rift was undeniable. I had survived Chicago, survived on grit and caffeine, and I was finally starting to build a name for myself, designing boutique hotels, reimagining cafes into warm havens, even catching mentions in local design blogs. My work was gaining recognition, but at home, I was still invisible. At every family dinner, Dad would ask, "When are you joining the restaurants?" Brandon would joke about my fancy drawings, and Mom would smile, never defending me. Their favoritism wasn't subtle, it was a wall, and I was on the wrong side. Looking back, those years set the stage for everything that came after. I kept trying, kept pouring my love and loyalty into a family that measured my worth only in dollars and obedience. And though I didn't know it yet, returning to Tulsa was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where my success would become their lifeline, and their exploitation of me would push me toward the breaking point. What came next was the real test, building my career while slowly becoming the family's safety net, until the day it all collapsed. After graduating and returning to Tulsa, I threw myself into building my career with a determination that bordered on obsession. I started small, redesigning a friend's living room for a few $100s, then helping a local cafe reimagine its space with warm lighting and reclaimed wood, and before long, word of mouth began to spread. People liked the way my designs made them feel at home, and slowly, jobs turned into contracts, contracts turned into features in local blogs, and within 3 years, I had a modest but thriving interior design business that felt like mine. Something carved entirely out of sweat and late nights, with blueprints spread across my tiny apartment floor. But just as my life was finding stability, my family's needs began to creep back into my world. Starting with the night my mother was rushed to the hospital with severe chest pains. I can still feel the cold, sterile air of the waiting room clinging to my skin, as Dad sat stiff and silent, Brandon scrolling through his phone. And when the nurse finally said the words, "Insurance won't cover all of this," all eyes turned to me, as though I was the family's walking ATM. I wrote the check, hands shaking, thinking it was a one-time emergency. But it was only the beginning. I paid her medical bills, then covered gaps in the restaurant payroll, and before long Brandon started showing up at my apartment with his sheepish grin and excuses about short-term debts, or a food truck idea that just needs seed money. The food truck was a disaster. A greasy, half-painted van that broke down twice in its first month, and when it folded, he didn't apologize. He simply shrugged and said, "You've got this covered, right?" Dad backed him up, of course, calling it a lesson in entrepreneurship. Each dollar I gave, each check I wrote, felt like pouring water into a bottomless pit, and yet part of me still hoped that one day my sacrifices would earn recognition. But instead of gratitude, every family gathering became a stage for disappointment. Holidays were the worst. The scent of roast turkey mingling with Dad's booming voice praising Brandon for showing up late, the sound of my mother fussing over him like he was still 12, and the silence whenever I tried to share a story about a design project. I remember sitting at the oak dining table one Christmas, Brandon bragging about some half-baked restaurant expansion idea, while Dad nodded proudly. And when I mentioned that one of my boutique redesigns had been featured in a regional magazine, the room went quiet, until Mom quickly changed the subject to Brandon's ambition. I laughed it off in front of them. But later that night, alone in my car, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, wondering how much more of this I could take. I had read somewhere on Bright Side. Actually, that journaling can help you recognize patterns of manipulation. So I bought a cheap spiral notebook and started writing everything down. The times they asked for money, the excuses they gave, the way I felt invisible no matter what I accomplished. Looking back, those pages became my lifeline, proof that I wasn't imagining things. According to the National Alliance for Caregiving, 9% of family caregivers report serious mental health struggles, and I was living proof of that statistic. My sleepless nights weren't just stress, they were the cost of being the family's safety net. And yet, in quiet rebellion, I found small ways to reclaim myself. Inspired by a Reddit revenge story, I stumbled upon where someone refused to pay for their sister's kids and instead donated to a charity. I started doing something similar. Instead of funneling every extra dollar into my brother's schemes, I began anonymously donating to a local shelter that helped single mothers set up safe housing. The first time I clicked submit on a $500 donation, I felt lighter than I had in years. It was as though for once, my money was building something real instead of patching Brandon's failures. I never told my family about it, but those donations were my secret act of healing. My way of saying, my work, my effort, my money, it matters, even if you don't see it. Still, the cycle at home continued. Brandon would boast about big plans at the dinner table while asking me privately for just a few thousand more. Dad would glare at me if I hesitated, and Mom would whisper, "He's family, Jennifer. You can't just let him fail." But every check I wrote was like stitching a wound that never closed, and deep down I knew I was enabling them, not saving them. The resentment was piling up, each slight another stone on my chest, until the weight was unbearable. There were nights I'd sit in my darkened office, sketches scattered around me, the hum of my computer filling the silence, and I'd wonder how much more I could give before I broke entirely. My journal was filled with phrases like, used, invisible, not enough, and I knew something had to change. Still, part of me held on to hope that if I proved myself successful enough, generous enough, they'd finally look at me with pride instead of expectation. That hope crystallized into a single idea, a final desperate attempt at recognition, a business proposal that could tie my design skills to the family legacy, a way to prove once and for all that I was worthy. What I didn't realize then was that this idea, my last olive branch, would not only be rejected, but would ignite the fuse that blew everything apart. 5 years into my career, when my portfolio finally included boutique hotels, restaurants, and high-end residential spaces, I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment I could bridge the gap with my family. So I poured weeks into preparing a proposal for a sustainable design firm, something that would combine my expertise with their restaurant legacy, reviving struggling locations with eco-friendly interiors that would save money long-term and give our brand a fresh image. I rehearsed my pitch in front of the mirror, smoothed out every slide, and walked into that family meeting with my heart pounding, the scent of Dad's cigars already thick in the dining room air. Brandon slouched in his chair, Tara beside him looking anxious, Mom quietly setting out coffee. I laid out the numbers, the potential partnerships, even examples of restaurants in Chicago that had doubled revenue after similar redesigns. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then Dad chuckled, low and dismissive. "Jennifer, that's cute, but we don't need mood lighting and fancy chairs. We need hard work. Brandon's ideas are real business." Brandon leaned back, smirking, tossing a balled-up napkin at me like we were kids again. Mom whispered, "Maybe now's not the time, sweetheart," avoiding my eyes, while Tara gave me a quick, sympathetic glance that said more than words. I felt my chest cave in, my careful proposal crumpling like that napkin. Later that night, desperate to understand if I was truly the problem, I posted anonymously on Reddit's r/Am the Asshole, asking, AITA for wanting to modernize my family's restaurants with sustainable design. The responses flooded in. NTA. They're exploiting you. Document everything. That phrase stuck in my head, document everything, and it planted a seed of suspicion that maybe my family's money issues weren't just bad luck or poor timing. It wasn't long before my suspicions found a target. One evening, after another tense dinner, I slipped into the hallway to grab my coat and overheard Brandon and Dad in the study, voices low but urgent. Brandon's words cut through the crack in the door. "She'll never know about the accounts. And with the will, it won't matter, everything's mine anyway." My stomach turned cold as I pressed closer, barely breathing, remembering the therapist's advice I'd once read about gray rocking, staying calm, showing nothing, even when you want to scream. I stood there, motionless, heart pounding like a drum, forcing my face into blankness. Dad's gravelly voice followed. "Just keep her happy enough to keep paying. She's useful for now." My hand shook on the doorknob, but I didn't go in. I slipped out quietly, the night air sharp and bitter against my skin. For the first time, I wasn't just hurt, I was calculating. I remembered one of the Reddit replies. "If they lie about money, assume theft." That night, I dug through old bank statements, receipts, even the journals I'd been keeping. Patterns started to emerge. Brandon asking for loans that lined up suspiciously with sudden shortfalls in Tara's household account, money disappearing from joint family funds. Later, Tara herself would confirm what I had begun to suspect. Brandon had been siphoning money from her without her knowledge. When she whispered it to me one afternoon, her hands clutching her coffee cup so tightly it trembled, she said, "I thought it was my mistake. But it was him. Always him." The look in her eyes was a mix of shame and quiet desperation, as if she, too, had been manipulated into silence. The betrayal ran deeper than I could have imagined. Per caregiver.org, 38% of family businesses fail due to internal theft, and I realized I was staring that statistic in the face. My own brother was draining us dry, protected by my father's blind loyalty, while I was expected to bankroll the entire mess. Every check I'd written suddenly replayed in my mind. Not as love, not as loyalty, but as manipulation. And yet, in that moment, I didn't explode. I didn't storm into the study or confront Brandon at the dinner table. I practiced gray rocking, holding my silence, knowing that showing my rage would only feed their narrative of me being too emotional. Instead, I smiled when Brandon asked for another loan, wrote it down in my journal, and quietly began to distance myself. But inside, something had shifted permanently. The Jennifer who still craved their approval was dying, replaced by someone harder, sharper, and less willing to be used. Still, the emotional twist came unexpectedly. A week after that discovery, Tara lingered after dinner, helping me stack plates. She leaned close and whispered, "You know, I see what they do to you. I'm sorry." For a moment, I saw in her eyes the same weariness that haunted my own, and I realized she wasn't just a bystander, she was trapped too. Manipulated by Brandon's entitlement and my parents' favoritism. That tiny flicker of solidarity gave me strength, proof that I wasn't crazy. Yet even her quiet admission couldn't soften the blow of what came next, the moment that would sever the last thread between me and my family. Because just when I thought I'd learned the worst of their betrayal, my phone buzzed late one evening with a new message from Mom, and those 6 words would hit harder than anything I had overheard. "Don't call or come over, we're done." When that late-night text from my mother appeared on my phone, "Don't call or come over, we're done." I stared at it for a long time, the glow of the screen painting my empty apartment in cold blue light, the silence so thick I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I didn't cry, I didn't plead, I simply set the phone down, knowing deep in my bones that this was their way of cutting me off, of reminding me that in their eyes, I was disposable the moment I stopped being useful. The next morning, though, the reversal began. My phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from Dad, Brandon, even Tara, each voicemail layering guilt upon threat. "Jennifer, you don't mean this." Mom's voice wavered in one. "Family doesn't turn their back like this." Another was Dad, his voice gruff and sharp. "You're acting ungrateful. After everything we've given you, this is how you repay us?" Brandon, of course, tried manipulation cloaked as charm. Sis, come on. You know you'll cave, you always do. I sat in my dim office, the curtains drawn, listening to each message echo against the bare walls, until the sound of their voices became unbearable. It felt like they were in the room with me, circling like vultures. That night, I remembered an article I'd read on Good is about empowerment, suggesting something radical: temporarily block the numbers to reclaim your peace. My hands shook as I pressed block, one by one. The silence that followed strangely terrifying, but also liberating, like stepping into fresh snow where no footprints had been before. But liberation doesn't erase pain. Cutting off payments felt like yanking an IV out of someone who had become addicted to it, and the withdrawal was violent. Dad texted threats about lawyers and family duty. Brandon sent venomous messages about me being selfish while he was trying to provide for his kids, conveniently forgetting I had been the one paying for those kids' diapers years earlier. Even Mom, the quiet one, turned sharp. Your father's blood pressure is through the roof. Do you want him dead? Each word clawed at the old part of me that still longed to be accepted. And there were nights I sat in the dark, their words echoing, wondering if I had done the unforgivable. Research from the National Caregiver Alliance shows that 47% of caregivers experience depression after family betrayal, and I was no exception. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my chest heavy with guilt and grief, my stomach twisted into knots. To keep myself from collapsing, I reached outward, searching for people who understood. I joined a private Facebook group called Toxic Family Recovery, where strangers posted screenshots of manipulative texts, survival strategies, even jokes that made the unbearable feel lighter. For the first time, I saw my life mirrored back not as failure, but as a pattern, one I wasn't alone in. Members told me, "Stay no contact, document everything, you're not crazy." Those words became my shield. I began to reclaim the pieces of myself that had been buried under obligation. I poured my energy into design projects again, sketching late into the night, the scratch of my pencil filling the silence where their voices used to echo. I lit candles in my apartment, filled it with warmth and plants, reminding myself that I could create beauty even in solitude. Each day without their demands was both terrifying and freeing. And while my phone remained heavy with unread messages, I refused to unlock the cage I had just escaped. There were moments of weakness, yes, the urge to call, to explain myself, but I'd open my journal instead and read the old entries, the evidence of years of exploitation, until my resolve hardened again. Gray rocking had been a survival tactic when I lived within their orbit, but now distance itself was my survival. The irony, of course, was that my silence only made them louder. The blocked calls turned into emails, the emails into hand-delivered letters slipped under my office door, the words growing more desperate with each attempt. "We need you. You'll regret this. Family is everything." One night, sitting in the half-dark, I played a voicemail that had slipped through from an unknown number. It was Brandon, his voice slurred with anger, threatening to show everyone what kind of person you really are if I didn't pay his latest debt. My blood ran cold, but I didn't reply. Instead, I closed my laptop, whispered to myself, "I've made my choice, not out of spite, but survival." Yet even as I sank into that fragile peace, I knew it couldn't last forever. The messages, the guilt, the threats, they were leading somewhere, tightening like a storm on the horizon. And I could feel it coming, the inevitable confrontation, the moment when I would sit across from them one last time, not in a home or a restaurant, but in a cafe where everything would finally explode. A week after the text wars and sleepless nights, I agreed to meet my family at a cafe in downtown Tulsa, a neutral ground with soft lighting, the hiss of an espresso machine in the background, and the faint scent of cinnamon in the air. I remember sitting at a corner table, my journal tucked into my bag like armor, as I watched them file in, Dad stone-faced, Mom tight-lipped, Brandon smirking with his usual arrogance, Tara trailing behind with eyes that darted nervously around the room. The tension was immediate, thick as fog. Dad launched first, his voice sharp. "Jennifer, we're giving you a chance to come back. to do right by this family. I let him talk, then calmly placed a stack of photocopied bank statements on the table. Pages that showed Brandon's loans weren't just poor business moves, but outright theft from Tara and hidden accounts that bled the restaurants dry. Brandon's smirk faltered, his face flushing crimson as Tara gasped, realizing the extent of what I had already suspected. Mom whispered, "This can't be true." But the evidence was right there in black and white. I stayed composed, recalling the therapist's words about gray rocking, "Don't feed the chaos." I simply said, "I won't be your ATM anymore." Brandon exploded, shouting about betrayal. Dad pounded the table so hard the cups rattled, but I didn't flinch. Tara, tears in her eyes, whispered, "He took from me too." And for a moment the mask slipped. She wasn't just complicit, she was broken by him as well. I stood, my hands steady at last, and told them, "This is the last time we meet like this." Then I walked out, the cafe doorbell chiming behind me like the sound of freedom. The fallout came quickly. Within a year, the restaurants once my father's pride filed for bankruptcy, the debts too heavy, Brandon's mismanagement too deep. Rumors swirled in town. Unpaid vendors, lawsuits, even whispers of fraud. Tara finally left Brandon, her quiet courage blossoming after years of being drained. My father's name, once respected, became a cautionary tale, and my mother faded into silence. Her texts no longer commands but fragments of regret that I never answered. Meanwhile, I flourished. I took the pain and the betrayal and, guided by a therapist's advice to rewrite your narrative, I launched a new design firm focused on sustainable spaces, the very idea they had once mocked. Within months, my work was featured in regional magazines, then national ones, and I expanded into mentoring young designers who, like me, had been dismissed or underestimated. On the side, I joined online communities like R Divided by Raised by Narcissists and Toxic Family Recovery, not as someone seeking advice anymore, but as someone offering it. I mentored people who felt trapped, reminding them that boundaries weren't cruelty, they were survival. I even shared my story in a small self-published book called Boundaries Are Beautiful, which I put up on Etsy. To my shock, it sold steadily, not because it was perfect, but because it was raw, real, and people connected with it. What I learned was that true revenge isn't slamming doors or shouting back, it's thriving. It's watching your life bloom after walking away from those who tried to clip your wings. Per the American Psychological Association, people who set and enforce boundaries report a 50% reduction in stress, and I lived that statistic. For the first time, I slept without fear of my phone buzzing with demands. For the first time, money I earned went into my future, not my brother's failures. And for the first time, I looked in the mirror and saw not a desperate daughter or forgotten sister, but a woman who had survived, rebuilt, and risen higher than she thought possible. Sometimes I still think about that text "we're done," and I realize it wasn't a curse. It was a blessing disguised as cruelty. It forced me to step out of the shadow of a toxic legacy and into my own light. So if you've ever been the odd one out, if you've ever had to cut ties to save yourself, know this: you're not alone. Your stories matter, and walking away doesn't make you weak, it makes you free. And if you need a sign that it's okay to put yourself first, let this be it. True family isn't who drains you, it's who celebrates you. My journey is proof that survival can turn into strength, and strength into joy. And maybe, just maybe, your story can do the same for someone else.